Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Doug Olenek, and I am the online editor for SC Media and your moderator for this program, which is sponsored by ThreatX. The topic is the AppSec Kill Chain Evolved, TTPs for Modern AppSec Demands. Joining us is Kelly Brazil, Vice President of Systems Engineering at ThreatX. Now, before we let Kelly get started, I'd like to mention one quick housekeeping item. There will be a question and answer period after the presentation, so please place your questions in the space provided, and don't be shy. We'd love to see lots of questions. Now, as any good football defensive coordinator knows, preparation is the key to keeping the other team off the scoreboard, and the same holds true for cybersecurity pros. In order to properly defend against adversaries, an organization must be aware of the specific TTPs used at each phase of an attack. So today, Kelly will run through a lifecycle approach to understanding web app attacks, share examples of the tools and techniques used in each phase, and the defense's security teams can employ to protect their applications. And with that said, I'd like to turn the show over to Kelly.
All right, thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. So we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting today. We're going to be talking about the evolution of the kill chain as it pertains to AppSec. So a lot of times when we talk about the kill chain or some other models like the MITRE ATT&CK model we'll get into a little bit here, it's usually in terms of network security or endpoint security. So we're going to see how we can utilize those same concepts for AppSec and see, there's a couple things that are a little bit different, but the concepts hold true. And we're going to talk about some of these key TTPs, and we'll get into what that means, but you can kind of think of those as just behaviors of the attackers. So key behaviors and countermeasures, which would include all the major stages of infrastructure and anonymization, reconnaissance and enumeration, gaining credential access, exploitation and detection, evasion, and post-exploit damage and malware. So we'll get into each one of those in more detail and see how we can not only detect but also kind of have some countermeasures for those. And so without further ado, let's get into it. All right. So any discussion about the kill chain wouldn't be complete if we didn't give a little bit of history about where the kill chain concept started. So a lot of people are probably aware that Lockheed Martin kind of came up with this concept back in 2011, and it was kind of a novel approach back then. But it was actually very important because it helped us all get the same vocabulary when it came to how cyber threats were performed, or cyber attacks were performed. It kind of defined high-level phases, and then helped us to kind of think about, where we could provide coverage for those types of actions. So it was very high level. It was talking about persistent attackers, or APTs, or advanced persistent threats. And, even APTs as a term has a history that's rooted in the military and goes years back, but was kind of popularized by some, including FireEye, as they kind of showed how this actually works in practice. So it's a very important concept that kind of helps us to frame the way that we talk about and also defend against cyber attacks, especially advanced cyber attacks. And this is also widely replicated across the industry. So a lot of times when we talk about a kill chain, we're not necessarily talking about the Lockheed Martin version of the kill chain. There's a lot of different versions of it that kind of apply to their specific domain. And you're going to kind of see that here in the AppSec domain as well. So there's also another framework. Actually, there's several frameworks, but another kind of popular one is called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And this one was started in 2013, so a little bit after the kill chain. But it's more specific than some of the other frameworks because it's focusing on specific tactics, techniques, and procedures, or what we call TTPs. I've also seen it called tools, tactics, and procedures. And again, like we mentioned, just think of TTPs as behaviors, right? So we're looking at kind of general or even sometimes specific behaviors that are done by the attackers so that we can identify those and then take countermeasures. Now, originally, the MITRE ATT&CK framework was focused really on Windows networks, so mostly kind of endpoint and some networking type of stuff. But we're going to talk about how we can sort of apply this concept of using TTPs or behaviors for AppSec as well. So let's talk about how we can apply the kill chain and the MITRE for AppSec. So if we think about the cybersecurity kill chain approach, there's some strengths and weaknesses to it. So the nice thing about it is it sort of identifies that connected nature of the attack phases. And so what it means is that it is literally a chain. So if you disrupt any link in that chain, then you can actually disrupt the entire attack. And that's relatively true. Now, in practice, not all levels, not all sections of the chain can be used. Some sections can be skipped and things like that. But for the most part, if you have protections for every part of that kill chain, then you're in pretty good shape. The limitations to the kill chain is that it's super high level, doesn't have any details really needed to implement. It doesn't tell you what to look for specifically in each of those links of the chain. It's really up to you to figure that out, or up to the security vendor that you have in place to basically implement those things. So we can get a little bit more detailed. So let's talk about the attack framework. Now, its strengths are that it has highly detailed and growing list of behaviors, or TTPs, that it's looking for. But the limitation is that a lot of those TTPs are really Windows focused, and some Linux and other endpoint, but it wasn't really designed from the ground up for application security, like securing web applications or APIs. So what we want to do is really kind of take the best of both worlds here. So apply that detailed TTP and behavior focus that's found in the MITRE ATT&CK model, and kind of fit that into the different links of the cybersecurity kill chain for app security specifically, right? So let's dive into that a little bit. All right. So first of all, let's understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures for AppSec, or these behaviors. So if you think about a kill chain for AppSec, it's going to kind of look something like this. And attackers are going to sort of follow this progression. And again, like we said, sometimes steps will be skipped. So it's not strictly true that every link in this chain is going to be used for every attack. So just keep that in mind. But the idea is you do want to have coverage for each of these. So if you have an understanding of all the behaviors that are associated with each of these links in the chain, then you can build the appropriate defenses, either within your application, or within your own kind of custom developed protections, or by enabling these types of protections within a security device, like a WAF or firewall or ACLs and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways we can apply this knowledge. So let's talk about the first link in the chain here: attacker infrastructure and anonymity. So before an attacker even starts an attack, or even starts a reconnaissance, right, for the attack, they need to have infrastructure to base that attack from. And ideally, they want to do that anonymously. So they want to be able to kind of obscure their identity when they are doing this. So there's several ways they can do this. First of all, there's so much cheap hosting available out there. If you look at the Distilled Bad Bot report that was just released recently, you can see that 73% of malicious bots are launched from data centers that are from large cloud hosting providers, and typically those IP addresses are coming from the United States. So it's very cheap and easy for them to kind of anonymize themselves. And, they're not using their own laptop at home, so we can trace it back to them. They're just kind of using this freely available infrastructure. In addition, ThreatX Labs just released a blog post a few weeks ago that outlines a huge anonymous proxy infrastructure that was found through our research. And that's being sold on the black market and being used by bots and other attackers as well. So the idea is that this is a single piece of infrastructure that can be shared across bad actors, and it's relatively cheap and easy for them to do this, and it helps them to kind of use that buffer so that you can't identify them, right? They're just doing this anonymously. In addition to that, we see what we call fast flux. And that's where the attackers are constantly shifting their IP addresses to evade static signatures on, say, a WAF or a lower level type of firewall. And so this is definitely something that we do see in the wild, right? So a lot of attacks will originate, just a few attacks will happen on one IP, then they'll hop to another IP, even though it's the same attacker. And this can kind of give the impression of a slow and low type of attack, so not any one IP address is really triggering the defenses. And of course, there's always those compromised hosts out there that are part of the botnets. They've got malware on their machines, either through phishing or some other means, and now they are ready to be used by the attackers. And again, they just basically purchase time on these compromised hosts, so they can be anonymous. And then finally, you have these services out there, just anonymizing proxies or even Tor, that will anonymize the source IP of the attack. So really, it's kind of important to note that when you're being attacked, typically the IP address that you're seeing is not really the attacker's IP. It's just one of these type of compromised hosts or anonymizing proxies. So how can we kind of fight against this first link in the chain, if you'd like to call it that? So one of the things you can do is you can track and correlate multiple contexts of risk. So you want to go beyond just the IP address when you're kind of looking at these things. So one thing that is very popular is to do geolocation-based rules. So if you're not doing any business outside of the United States or some other country, a lot of times you can do geo-blocking and just say, hey, either I want to block or significantly raise the risk score for traffic that's coming in from outside the United States. And there's other well-known, bad IP addresses or Tor exit nodes and things like that you can do the same thing. Now, a lot of times you could do this manually just by pulling your own lists, or if your security device or platform has these Tor exit nodes already built in, or anonymizing proxies, then you can just basically turn on that functionality to be able to see that intel and use it in your countermeasures. And another thing you can do is called fingerprinting. And so this is a way that you can basically track attackers as they hop around IP addresses. So remember that fast flux. So the idea is you can actively inject cookies and JavaScript. So very similar to technologies that we're all familiar with, like Google ads and things like that. Where they're basically injecting things to be able to track you around as you hop around IP addresses. And that's something that a web application firewall, a next-gen web application firewall can do as well by actively engaging the attacker. So the important thing there is that they're able to basically link all of these different IP addresses together into a single entity. That way, you don't get that slow and low type of effect, but all the activity for that particular actor is being correlated together into one single entity. So it makes it a lot easier to kind of spot that action, that activity happening. All right, and so let's talk about the next link in the chain, reconnaissance and enumeration. So this is where the attackers actually started to do something. And what they're trying to do is, before they even try to attack something, they want to know what is available to attack. So they're going to try to identify all the services and the applications and APIs and API endpoints and different maybe hidden links and things on your websites to target. So you're going to see a lot of common TTPs here. So You're going to notice automated crawlers, scanners, search engines. Popular ones are like Shodan, bot-based scanners. You'll see things like Kali Linux type of tools, including Burp Suite and Nikto and things like that. So sometimes you can kind of fingerprint what type of tool the attacker is using. And then, like we mentioned, API enumeration. This could also just be your web application enumeration too. Like you see a lot of 400 errors, 404s, and things like that going to endpoints that don't exist because they're just kind of scanning or fuzzing your APIs and things like that. So these are all kind of the TTPs that you see here. And so some of the countermeasures for this type of thing is being able to find whether this is a good bot or a bad bot, right? So first of all, just kind of have to understand not all reconnaissance is going to be detectable. Crawlers, they're just part of the internet. They've always been there, right? These robots are just scanning the applications. So what you can do is pen test and scan your applications to make sure that they're not really vulnerable. Maybe your robot's file isn't exposing data, and just make sure you don't have admin links on your page available and things like that, first of all. But you can also do reconnaissance detection to some extent. And this can be done via behavior analysis to distinguish human versus automated visitors. So, very simple things to more advanced things. So you can look for, how aggressively, is the entity scanning the site. If it's a very high intensity, that might look like a bot. Or you can profile the application and user behavior to see anomalies if they're hitting certain parts of the site in a different way than other users of the site. And then you can also leverage that fingerprinting that we talked about. So actively engage the users to see and correlate their behaviors over time to see if this looks like standard user behavior or does this look like an automated bot. And the other side is for API protection, extend that behavior analysis to your API. So not just on your web apps looking for this type of scanning and fuzzing, but also look at your public APIs to see if they're trying to get to API endpoints that don't exist. Maybe you're getting 400 errors or specific API errors, or they're fuzzing different fields within your API all the way down into the JSON. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of see here and potentially either slow down or block. The next chain here is credential access into accounts. So this is very common for web apps. So here's where you can actually start doing a little bit more. And this targets both the users and administrators. So don't forget about that, right? When the bad guys are targeting your web applications, they're not just targeting user accounts. They're also looking for /admin and other types of things like that, so they can actually go in and either deface or take over the site. And sometimes we'll talk about some of their goals later on. But some of the common behaviors here are things just like simple brute force. Well, where you'll see an entity just going through different user accounts and just trying to do different well-known passwords. And that could also be called password spraying. And a lot of times that's very easy to detect if it's happening from a single IPs, but it can become more difficult if it's coming from multiple IPs. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Credential stuffing is becoming more and more common. I hear this every day from customers that credential stuffing is top of mind. And this is a little bit more advanced, right? So the attacker has purchased a list of known exposed username and passwords out there. And the theory, which actually does work in practice a lot of times, is that if a user has an account on one web application, then that user might be using the same username and password on other services, right? Because, hey, guess what? We're all lazy human beings, and we tend to reuse our username and password. We don't want to, remember a lot of passwords. So hopefully that practice is being reduced with the, increased use of password managers. So people are using different username and password, or at least different passwords on different services. But still, this is still a very effective technique, and that's why you'll continue to see it being used. And then malicious automation. So if you think about both of these things, they could be done via a single IP, and then that's probably a little bit easier to detect. But now bots will spread that attack over many IP addresses, making it more difficult. So that's the major behaviors that we're looking for. So what can we do to kind of detect and mitigate this? So first of all, behavior profiling to detect abnormal spike access attempts. And this is really where state needs to be kept, right? So if you can keep state for each fingerprinted IP and see, how many access attempts they've tried in the past, X number of minutes, that's something to be done, and that type of thing will be useful on the last. So that's a simple countermeasure. But then you want to do other things too, like look at the user agent strings. Where's the attack coming from? Geolocation, these attackers, because sometimes it's hard to tell because they are hiding behind multiple IP addresses. And by the way, you don't just have to block here. You can also do what we call tarp hitting. So tarp hitting is really just, the idea is you're just making it more expensive for the attacker by slowing down the responses. So, user logins don't necessarily need to be immediate. You can actually slow those down without really affecting the user experience. Whereas the rest of the application, you want to be very, pretty snappy. But if you can slow down those login attempts, then you're just making it more costly for the attacker. So that's a good, pretty simple type of countermeasure you can take there. And probably the most effective is just multi-factor authentication, where it's something you have and something and it could be either a hardware software token, it could be SMS message, though that does have its weaknesses. But this is probably the best thing that you can do, because that drastically reduces the account takeover success rate. So a lot of times this does add friction to the app. So there is resistance to this by the application owners sometimes, but we're seeing more and more adoption of MFA on applications. And again, this is not just for the users of the application, but you also want to use MFA for the admin side of it as well. Those credentials, if they get hacked, can be used for other nefarious things down the line that we'll talk about. Okay, and then second to the last one here is security and detection evasion. So the attackers, they pretty much expect that you're going to have something in between them and the web application or API that's going to be inspecting what they're doing. It could be something as simple as a ACL or stateful inspection firewall, or it could be something a little bit more advanced like an IPS device. Or, best yet, you want to have something like a web application firewall that really understands that layer 7. So though, there's lots of web application firewalls out there, there are very common evasion techniques that are out there. So some common behaviors here are things like exploit encoding. So these are techniques that help you to evade signature matching. And since a lot of WAFs are signature-based, this is one way to evade them. And typically this happens because the WAF is tuned to tune out some of these signatures, because pretty much every WAF is going to have evasion techniques built into it, but a lot of times they'll signal a lot of false positives, and that's why they get tuned out, and then that's how the attackers will get in. So an example of this is encoding, like HTML encoding or base64 or hex encoding, Unicode. There's just so many different ways to encode. So, and then you can encode multiple layers. So if you look over to the right-hand side there, that's an example where you're taking your traditional directory traversal string of .. right? And you might have multiples of those. If you just see that, kind of in its naked form like that, that's easy to see that, hey, someone's trying to maybe go back in the directory and look for another file where it shouldn't be. But if you encode it and looks like %252e, %252e, etc., then if you have a misconfigured WAF, or if you're just using a firewall or an IDS that doesn't understand these types of techniques, then those attacks are going to get through. So those are definitely behaviors that need to be detected. And also API-based exploits. It's not enough just to look into the headers and the arguments and just the body and do regular expression type of signatures. Nowadays, a lot of the logic, the business logic in the application is using JSON, whether it's in the body, say in a web app, or more commonly in an API, or what we're also seeing nowadays is JSON being used within WebSockets. And WebSockets is used to speed up the performance of the application. So you need to be able to inspect for injection type of attacks all the way down into the JSON of the application. So that means being able to parse JSON, even XML actually. You don't want to forget about XML either, but JSON seems to be super common these days. So make sure that you're able to actually look for these types of evasions, because they might be trying to bury these attacks within the JSON body. So what are the countermeasures here? Well, you really need a bunch of things working together. There's no silver bullet. It used to be that we tried to just rely on signatures to do this, but that doesn't really work anymore. So really what it comes down to is a combination of profiling the application to see what's normal for that application, and then also profiling the attacker behavior. So looking for all of these TTPs, right? So we're not, I'll introduce the term IOC, right? You've probably heard of that, indicators of compromise. IOCs are very specific signatures of something that happened that you can see, okay, that's a bad thing. But we're talking about TTPs, or behaviors, so more general, because the idea is you want to look for both known and unknown threats. So that's covered by looking at the application behavior, what's kind of abnormal and what's normal there, attacker behavior, what's normal and abnormal in their behaviors, and then also active engagement. So being able to fingerprint, deceive, tar pit, other things that you can do, interrogate, watch them as they're traversing different IP addresses. All these things together will give you a comprehensive countermeasures for these types of things. And again, also having native support for APIs. So whether it's JSON, XML, even WebSockets, to be able to see these types of things. And obviously, looking for encoded characters and content. And not only looking for encoded characters, but looking, several layers deep, because things can be encoded within encoded within encoded. So those are other ways to evade as well. That typically your WAF, and in this case, a next generation WAF can help with, because basically instead of just using signatures, you're basically using all of these techniques together as a whole. And then let's talk about the final stage here, post-exploitation damage. So the whole idea of the attacker is to have some type of end game in mind, right? They either want to pivot deeper into the network, or they want to do ransomware, or they want to reflect attacks back onto the users of the application so they can exploit other users. So there's a lot of different things here. So the common TTPs will be, looking for that ransomware, and this could be, before you even get to that point, you want to be able to identify specific exploits or vulnerabilities, like say, Apache struts or JBoss vulnerabilities, things like that. So those are common vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and then once they're exploited, these types of post-exploitation damage can be done as far as like ransomware, things like that. They can deliver malware. So maybe, they get some type of administrative access to the site, and now they can actually change the JavaScript that's being sent down to the user, and that can do some exploit on the client side to download malware to the end users, and that can definitely, betray the trust of the users of the site. There's a lot of different ways that can happen. And then also internal pivoting. So the idea here is that you gain a foothold on the public side of the web app, but then you can actually use the internal APIs that the web app might be using, because now that server has access to the internal database and things like that to do further attacks inside the application. So the countermeasures here are basically some of the things we talked about earlier, but behavior monitoring of the applications to identify changes, right? So if your application hasn't been, if there hasn't been a new application deployed by the DevOps team, and then all of a sudden the application changes its behavior, that's definitely something that you want to look for. But also something that shouldn't be overlooked is looking deeper into the application. It's very common to have protections on the outside, so we kind of call that the crusty outside countermeasures, right? Your firewalls, your application firewalls. But nowadays, you want to have a defense in depth, so you want to be also covering those internal microservices and APIs deeper in and see the behaviors of those microservices as they're talking to each other, because those can be pivot points for the attackers. So again, don't neglect the internal microservices and APIs, because at the end of the day, most of the time those are just web applications. Those are just running on port 80 or 443, or even if they're running on a non-standard port, they are just HTTP at the end of the day, and they're just running RESTful calls over them, and those need to be inspected as well. So the idea here is that you want a coordinated defense and context. And context is really the key here, because in the old days of just using signatures or rules on a firewall, you're really attacking each one of these stages in isolation, and there's no coordination, so that you don't really understand the state or the progression of the attack as it's happening. But nowadays, what you want to do is actually keep state for the each user of the application and see if they're progressing up this kill chain, because now that gives you all the evidence and breadcrumbs, so that if you do need to block them, you can be very confident that you're blocking them accurately. Or if you're doing an investigation, you don't want to be throwing away data that's very useful to understand what may have happened in the past and how they got to that state. For example, it could be very difficult after the fact, if you see something that's already in the exploitation phase, to go back to your SIM and recreate everything that happened for that particular attacker, because that attacker may have hopped around IP addresses, up to that point. So if you're not correlating all that data together in real time, then you're really making it more difficult for yourself down the road. So to kind of bring this all together, one of the ways that you can do this is by utilizing a next generation WAF. And the important thing about next generation WAF versus traditional WAF is that it's not strictly signature based, right? So we're not using hundreds of thousands of signatures to be able to decide in a split second, is each web request a good request or a bad request. What you're doing is you're keeping state on all of the users of the application to understand their behaviors over time, and to see how aggressively they're using the application, or whether they're progressing up a kill chain. And the other important thing about keeping state on them is that you can actively engage them to see if they're hopping around IP addresses, if they're part of a botnet. You can send them deceptive information to see if they're triggering on things they shouldn't. You can also tar pit them, so you can make it more expensive for them to carry out these attacks. So there's a lot of mitigation features that are available in a next-gen WAF that basically pulls all of these things together, whether it's application profiling, the end user behavior profiling, and also the engagement with the end user. And then finally, you want to be cloud native, because no longer is it enough to just be able to protect the public web applications, but now there's public APIs, and there's also microservices that are APIs that need to be protected. And then you need to be able to see inside of the JSON and XML inside of the APIs, and even down into the WebSockets if that technology is being used to be able to look for injection attacks inside of the JSON or XML. So these are all things that are kind of above and beyond just traditional WAF or even IDS and traditional ACLs and firewalls that need to be taken into account, and things that are all available via a next generation WAF. So the takeaways here: you must be able to continually adapt to new attacker TTPs or behaviors. So the attackers are always kind of changing the game, but the idea is if you're looking at tactics and procedures, you're ahead of the curve because now you're not limited to just IOCs or signatures that go out of date very quickly and only find known attacks, whereas by looking at behaviors, you're looking at both known and unknown attack vectors. You want to maintain context across the life cycle of the attack. And this is key because now you're not just looking at every single web request in isolation, but you're looking at the whole behaviors of the attacker, even as it hops around IP addresses, so you can see what's really happening in real time and piece together what's going on instead of having to kind of build this investigation after the fact if there's an emergency, right? So then you're not going to be as in good shape there because now you're going to have to figure out how to correlate all these IP addresses together. You don't have the luxury of engaging with the attacker after the fact. You can only do that in real time. And it's going to take a blend of approaches. So just signatures aren't going to work, just behaviors aren't going to work. You've got to use behavior detections. You're going to have to pull in intel from third-party sources, and you're going to have to actively engage. And you can do this within the application in some cases. You can do this by integrating different security services in some cases. And probably the easiest way is just to have this all in a single platform that does this for you, like a next-generation WAF. All right, well, thank you for that. We're going to open up for questions, but before we do that, I just want to invite you to download our white paper that's called Application Security Evolved, and it'll talk about it talks about some of these things that we talked about in more detail. So if you're interested in that, feel free to download that. And now we'll open it up to Q&A.
All right, Kelly, great. Thanks for the presentation. And yep, as Kelly said, we're opening it up for Q&A now. So if you haven't put in any questions into the display area, please do so now, and we'll do our best to get to them. All right, we have a couple built up already, and the first one is, are there any responses other than blocking?
Yeah, that's actually very important because blocking is an important response, but sometimes earlier on in the kill chain, blocking is not appropriate because it's too error-prone. It's too prone to false positives. So some of the other types of actions you might want to do is interrogate, right? So if it's a login page or maybe it's a sensitive API call or something like that, you can interrogate by sending down cookies or JavaScript to basically fingerprint and figure out what, is this a real user or is it headless Chrome or Phantom JS or something like that. So that gives you more intel where you may not necessarily want to block, but it can inform a decision later on down the road because you're keeping state. Another action that could be important is tarp hitting. So let's say again, a login page is a good place for this, so you can make it more expensive for the attacker. Or a sensitive API call or an expensive API call. Maybe you have an API call for your internal cloud orchestration environment, and one of those API calls is to spin up a new disk image. Well, that's an expensive API call. You don't want that happening hundreds of times. So you can do tarp hitting there to slow that down to make sure if someone does exploit that, they're not going to do something that's really expensive on your network or on your application.
Okay, next, how do you maintain coverage and visibility when dev rolls out APIs without telling anyone?
Yeah, that's more and more common these days, right? So it used to be back in the old days with waterfall or whatever, right? Not only was the application changes less frequent, but everyone knew what was going on, and there was a whole kind of test cycle and tuning cycle that would go on. These days with CI/CD pipelines that are just kind of on autopilot and deploys might happen weekly or daily, you don't really even know when an application deploy happens. So What you really need is automation there, right? So application profiling is important so you can detect changes to the application and adapt automatically. And so that's a feature of a web application firewall that should be built in to a next-gen WAF.
Okay. Next, you didn't really cover DDoS attacks in the presentation. Is that something you address?
Yeah, so DDoS is definitely part of it. That can also be later on in the kill chain stages, right? That could be one of the end goals. Typically, though, with the DDoS, they don't even need to go through the previous stages, right? They can just go straight to DDoS because they don't need to really enumerate or whatever. They can just send a bunch of attacks. There are different types of DDoS, though. So if it's a layer 7 DDoS, they might have already done some of that reconnaissance and things like that. So we can see things like long-running queries and target or block based on risk for those types of things with the layer 7 DOS attack. But for the volumetric DDoS, that's something that you will typically just detect at your layer 3, layer 4. And then the mitigations there are typically to do some type of a routing change or scrubbing at the layer 3, layer 4 before it even hits the layer 7.
Okay. Next, this seems to have a combination of WAF and anti-bot topics. Do you see these as separate disciplines and solutions?
Well, they used to be. It used to be that you had, your WAF, and then you had your bot, and then you might have API gateways. So what's happening is that there's a lot of consolidation happening here to where you have a web application protection platform instead of individual point products doing these types of things. And so what's interesting with a next-gen approach like this, if you're using behavior detection, inherently what you're doing is you're keeping state on these entities or attackers. And that is interesting because that allows you to not only look at kind of your OWASP top 10 type of stuff, but also by keeping state, you can mitigate higher level attacks like the bot type of attacks like credential stuffing, account takeover, carding, all these types of things that require state to be kept. So yes, we are sort of blending it together now because those are all part of a next generation WAF to be able to handle all these types of attacks.
All right. Well, I think we have run to the end of our time here for today. Our thanks to Kelly for his presentation and to ThreatX for sponsoring the program. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. The webcast will be available shortly at www.scmagazine.com, and that can be found under the Events tab on that homepage. Thank you all again, and have a great day.